So, it's time we talked about the cult of mask tyranny. Yes, folks, it is a cult, and I'm going to prove that to you. So, stick with me, and I'll be right back. Hey, everybody, this is Deb with Truthification Chronicles, and I've got something a little bit different for you on this one because I want to talk a little bit about cults and the mask tyranny, and how this is really just some mass brainwashing techniques that are being used. So let's get on with it. Now, as a little bit of backstory, for 13 years, several years ago, I helped run one of the biggest chat room ministries in Yahoo Chat. And at the time, we were probably the longest running one, although it's really hard to say that because, the people were coming in and going and everything. But we had a pretty decent following, and at the time that we ended, after 13 years, I'd lost count of how many people that we'd worked with. The count at roughly halfway through was about 60,000 people. So, yeah, I got tired of writing them all down. I have like these books that are filled with chat names of people that we talk to and work with. So, yeah, it was something that was a moment in time, and it was necessary. It was a very interesting task. But one of the things that we dealt with specifically, because it was biblical counseling, we dealt with a lot of people who were caught up in false teachings, and especially with cults. Now, not every false teaching is from a cult, but when you get several of them put together, it does usually end up as a cult. And a lot of religious cults are part of what we dealt with on a daily basis. So I do have a little bit of knowledge of what I'm talking about, and I wanted to share that with you because I think a lot of what we saw in religious cults can be extrapolated to this whole mask tyranny thing and some of the other things happening in our society right now. So let's get going on this. First of all, religious cults tend to all use a similar type of mind control tactic when they're working with people. And part of the reason for that is because people's brains pretty much work the same way. And so if it works and it brainwashes people, then yeah, it manipulates them. So these tactics are often so subtle that people who are new recruits to that particular cult or whatever the movement is don't really understand and see that they are what they are, And so a lot of what we're seeing happening right now, I think, has to do with these kinds of tactics that are being used. And they're subtle, so a lot of people don't recognize them. Well, being so subtle, it allows the cult to break down the recruits' defenses until they are completely compliant with the cult's teachings. So again, I want you to kind of think more broadly than just religious cults. I want you to extrapolate that to what's going on, especially with the Democrat Party and with some of these groups that they've associated themselves with. So I think you'll start to see what I'm talking about with this. First of all, the main thing that they do, the very first thing, is to capture the recruits' emotions, because emotions are something that you can really play on, and you can use them to manipulate people. Well, here's the first thing they do. They often make the person who is the new recruit, they make them feel just so loved and accepted and like they are very significant to whatever movement this is. And you can see this in a lot of what the Democrats are doing, that they make the people feel this way, like they're part of something big. And this makes the person perceive the cult members care very much for them and sincerely have the best interests of that person in mind. So see, the recruit is thinking, yeah, they really care about me and they want the best for me. Well, that's what they're perceiving, because that's what the cult wants them to perceive. It's not necessarily true, but that's what they're perceiving. And perception sometimes can be everything. Well, then the next thing they do is they isolate the person, this recruit, from their emotional support resources. Now, what I found over the years, some of what we did in that ministry was kind of like a crisis hotline, because people would come in and, they would have these terrible situations that they were dealing with, and they felt like there was nobody in the world they could talk to. So they would come in and they would talk to us, and believe me, it was like they would bare their souls to us because they didn't know us, and so they felt like they could say whatever they wanted to say. And of course, some of them were not truthful in what they told us, but we always let God kind of sort that out. We just gave them the best advice we could from the Bible and let God deal with the rest. But we had a lot of suicidal people. And yes, I called 911 a few times on them. I've even talked to the FBI because of it. So yeah, we had a lot of people that had emotional problems. And one of the things that I found is that usually people who were very upset about things in their life, it was because they didn't have any emotional support resources to draw on. And when I say that, sometimes it's financial resources that can help people get through situations. But really, when it comes down to it, a lot of times for people to succeed through these difficult times in their life, it matters whether they have this emotional support. Now, it can be from friends or families, or, if you're in therapy, it can be from whoever your therapist is, that kind of emotional support. People need that. And if they're not getting it, then they look for alternative sources for it. And so this is one of the things that cults do. They isolate the person from those support resources and make themselves the total resource for that person emotionally. And we're going to talk about how that plays in just a minute. Since the cult has some special knowledge that outsiders don't have, and that's very important too, they're always going to claim that they see things properly and that how they're viewing the world is the real way to view it. And usually there's some special knowledge or special revelation involved because they believe that they have something that other people don't have. They have access to it. So that's why their cult is different from everybody else. So they encourage the new recruit to cut off ties to the uninitiated who are holding them back, so the recruit can focus on the special truth the cult has for them. You see, they'll never reach their true potential as long as they are hanging out with all these uninitiated people, the people who don't understand and appreciate the special revelation. This is one of the reasons the cult has them isolate themselves from other people. And almost every cult that I worked with, people trying to get out of, it really did work this way. That if there were, friends and family that would support this person, they had them cut them off. That was a very important part of how they work. Well, isolation is vital. It really is. And there are a couple reasons for that. The first is, if you think of solitary confinement in a prison, well, the reason they take a prisoner who has been a troublemaker and they put them in solitary confinement is because we are social beings. And when you put someone totally isolated from the rest of the world, the rest of humanity, it has a tendency to break people. And it can break down a person's spirit, the fight in them, and it can make their minds a lot more pliable. And so it will end up resulting in them being more docile, which makes them easier to control. And so when they cut off all of these outside ties and isolate the person, well, that sets up the recruit for another part of the brainwashing technique that we're going to talk about in just a minute. So what they're doing is they're putting in these layers, these steps that they follow. And when they follow these steps, it's amazing what can really happen to a person that is a new recruit coming in. So it also reduces opportunities for joining forces with others. That means that, if you're isolated, then you don't have much opportunity to talk with somebody else and say, you know what, this doesn't sound right to me. Does this sound right to you? And, you can't go back and forth with people because you're isolated. Your family members, for instance, wouldn't be able to say, you know what, that organization you're connected with, there's something just not right about it. And they would have you questioning. Well, the cults don't want that. They don't want you to question what they're telling you. So that's one reason why they isolate you like they do. And then the only people that you have connection with will be people in the cult who are solidly part of that. Well, then the next thing they do is they start the repetitive propaganda. This is really important. This hammers in the brain whatever message they're trying to tell you. And we've seen this a lot. You see this with the DNC. Just about every protest they have these chants that they say, and that's really what they're implementing. The cult has to take these filters that we naturally have in our brain, and it has to just destroy them before they can put in the indoctrination that they really need. All of their beliefs are kind of like programmed in there. So in some ways, this repetitive propaganda is a way of deleting stuff off the person's hard drive so they can fill it again with what they want to fill it with. And one of the things that it has to break through is our cognitive dissonance. Now, it seems like there are some people who have more of a filter than others. Probably if you're listening to this, you have more of a filter in your brain than people who don't. And so when presented with something, you will kind of filter through it and say, well, this sounds right, that doesn't sound right, this sounds right, that doesn't sound right. And a lot of times people will get that from their training when they're young and their parents are raising them. Now, I have one brother, he and his wife did a really good job when they were raising their kids, because when their kids would start to do something wrong, they'd say, now look, you've got a choice. If you do this, this will be the consequence. If you make this choice, this will be the result. So when they would do that, it benefited the kids, because then they filtered things. Instead of just accepting everything that went into their mind, they actually filtered all of these things and stopped for a moment and said, no, wait a minute, let's look at this. And that's something that not everybody has. And unfortunately, less and less people have it because they're not trained to think. They're trained to follow the crowd. And that's part of the problem we have with our, school system right now, because the public school system is really good at helping to weaken people's filters, their cognitive dissonance. And that's something that we need to be on guard with. But the cognitive dissonance is when somebody tells you something and you know that is not true. Like, for instance, if I say, the sky is green, and you'd go, what? No, it's blue. But I'd say, oh, no, the sky is green. Look at all the evidence that the sky is green. And this is where the cognitive dissonance comes in, because what your head knows is true, then something else is trying to hit on that. Well, most of the times, obvious things like that are really easy to contradict. But when it comes down to what the cults are trying to put in there, a lot of times, because now you've been isolated from all your resource people, your emotional resource, then it's easier for them to give you experiences that contradict what your insides are saying is true. When you're talking about these girls that were trafficked with Epstein, this is exactly what they did. This is what Ghislaine Maxwell did. She would break down their cognitive dissonance. She would treat them in a way so that they felt like, yes, she loves us and she's working for our best interests. She's not going to let anything bad happen to us. And when you look at how they dropped their filters, she worked on that. It took time, but that's what she did. And she got them to lower those filters and to just break down the whole cognitive dissonance. So when the girls were abused inside, they didn't see the difference. And I'm not saying they didn't totally, but I think that it was so weakened that there was very little resistance. And that's what was happening there. So you can see these tactics are everywhere. They're being used everywhere. Propaganda usually begins with the easily acceptable things, like, everybody says, oh, well, you're a good person. And you think, oh, well, yeah, I am a good person. And then they have all these acceptable statements. Then they start progressing little by little into more controversial things. And I have to tell you that when Obama was so fixated on his teleprompter, what was really going on is that he was using phrases. His speeches were crafted to use some of these mind control techniques in them. He would say things like, for instance, he'd say 2 or 3 things that were very acceptable to everybody, and then he'd slip in something that wasn't. Like he'd say, everybody wants their children to be safe. Well, all of us can say that, right? Nobody wants their children in danger. So the minds would be, yeah, we want to be safe. We want our children to be safe. And then he'd slip little things in like, that's why we need gun control. And if you looked at it, it was like 3 times, there would be 3 things. The first 2 would be, oh yeah. And then the third one would be something negative that we would not normally have agreed on. And what happens with something like that is your filter in your brain accepts the first 2, so the filter is more likely to accept what he says in the third one. And that's why a lot of his speeches, if you tear them down and you look at them from that perspective, that's why they were effective. They were a type of mind control. It's called neuro-linguistic programming, and that's what they really were. So whoever was writing his speeches was very skilled in neuro-linguistic programming. The repetitions increase as the filter starts to deteriorate. So you have a few repetitions at first, and then you start increasing them, and you start adding in the more undesirable things. You get these chants, the mantras. Like I said, this is what all their protests seem to have, these chants. They say the same thing over and over again. It's a type of mental programming that they're doing. That's what it is. They hear it over and over and over again. And this is why you have the talking points, because the 4 a.m. talking points that all these media outlets will receive, they all say the same thing with the same basic words. That's a type of programming that's happening. Neurolinguistic has to do with language and how language is used to program certain things in people's minds. And a lot of people do this. You can do it on a less extensive or invasive scale by just saying different words, more positive words to certain people, and it will encourage them and engage them more than some of the negativity. So it is a way to kind of control situations and control conversations that a lot of people know of, and some people just do it naturally. So the thing is about these chants and the mantras and all the repetitive statements that they have, eventually they start getting into the emotions, and they tie themselves to the emotions of the recruit. When the recruit hears these chants or mantras or certain words, it evokes these specific emotions in them. And that's very powerful. Emotions are very powerful things. And when you can tie somebody's beliefs to their emotions, it's hard to break through that. And then the other thing is they get this filter. Once they can get past it, then the recruit becomes just militant almost when people contradict them. It's like, wow, you need to believe this way. Oh, you can't believe that. It's wrong. It's wrong. And they get very upset. And that's one of the things you got to really look out for, because they have these beliefs so ingrained in them by this time that you can't contradict them. And when you do, look out, because it's not going to be nice. And then there's one other aspect that you have to have in this, and this is fear. There has to be fear introduced to the process along the way, because if there is no fear, you're not going to have control over them. And when you look at this, you have the recruit, they're isolated from their emotional resources, anybody outside of this small group, this cult, whatever it is, and then you insert this fear, and what's the fear? The biggest fear that I've seen when these cults are doing this is that they ostracize people. And they say, well, you dared question our beliefs. You can't do that. We will put you out, if you keep questioning. There's this threat that you are going to be ousted from this community now. Now, remember, I told you that they've been isolated. This recruit has been isolated from all their emotional resources. So all of their emotional resources now are invested in this cult. And if they are told, if you don't do certain things, you're going to be put out of this cult, then that's terrifying. It really can be very fear invoking. And one of the things that I wanted to point out is that this technique is a little bit more effective on women because women have a tendency to feel social ostracism worse or deeper than men do. Now, I'm not saying men don't feel it, but when men are being bullied in some way, men tend to bully people by, physical actions. They punch them, they push them, they shove them. But that's how men interpret bullying. If you talk to a man who has been pushed or shoved, he's going to see that as bullying. If somebody yells at him, calls him a name, chances are most men are just going to go, big deal. And they have an easier time letting those names, the verbal assaults kind of roll off their back. Women, on the other hand, they tend to bully other women verbally, or they just ostracize them. They turn their backs on them. Well, you don't fit in our group because your hair's not perfect and your dress isn't the right thing and you're not in style and, we just, there's all different kinds of things. Women, you know what I'm talking about, right? Sometimes it's really hard to get in with a group of women. If they don't like something little about you, you're not going to get in. And no matter how hard you try, you're just never going to fit in with them. They're not going to let you into their group. And chances are they're going to make little snide comments that will let you know that they disapprove of you. Okay? That's how women bully. They bully more verbally. And again, by shunning people and putting them out of their social group. So this is one of the reasons why when we're talking about these cults, sometimes you get a lot more women because of how women absorb things. And that we tend to be a little more social than a lot of men. Let's face it, if we put a man on an isolated island by himself and we put a woman on an isolated island by herself, I think probably the man would have an easier time not being around people than the woman. Now, that's not necessarily true for everybody, but for the most part, I think women have more of a tendency to need that social interaction with other people, which is good because that's how God created us. And, it's good having both sides of things. I really like the differences between men and women. I'm very glad God did that. The thing is, I want to take those concepts and I want to apply them to the masks and to the DNC in general. The first thing is you capture the recruits' emotions. So how do they capture our emotions when it comes to the masks? Well, they say, oh, you're such a caring person. Surely you don't want to risk other people's lives, so you'll wear a mask, won't you? That's the kind of thing that they put across. They are playing on our emotions to try to get us to wear a mask, to bully us into wearing a mask. And so that's the first thing. But they're playing on it, trying to make it sound like, oh, you can do this. You're such a caring person. And we're really depending on your love for humanity to do this. So this is what they do. And then, oh, we love you and we don't want you to get this horrible illness, so we're asking you to wear a mask. So can you see how it's really kind of the same thing as what goes on with the cult? And then you have the isolation, of course. Well, that's kind of obvious because you have quarantine yourself. Now, I understand that not everybody is in the same situation I am. And so when you quarantined yourself, you were probably with a few other people, your family or your spouse or something. And that's okay. But at some point, you probably got a little tired of seeing the same people all the time. And you wanted to see other people because we're social people. That's what God made us to be. Well, they also tell us we got to stay away from others. So even if you are with other people, you got to stay away from them. You got to keep them, 6 feet away. You don't want to get too close. That's not good. And if at all possible, stay at home. You've heard this, right? Haven't you heard this? Well, this is isolating us. And why do you isolate? You isolate because it breaks down that cognitive dissonance and it deteriorates that filter so they can get their propaganda in. That's what they're doing. And, they said, well, order things online so you can stay isolated. And that's how they were getting people to really be in this situation where the cognitive dissonance and the filters, they were being broken down. so that they could add in their lovely little mantras, and that's what they added next. You have all this repetitive propaganda, which the biggest thing was wear a mask, wear a mask, wear a mask, right? So you've heard that a zillion times. Wouldn't you like to have $1 for every time you heard that? Oh, I would, that's for sure. So then, the filter in your brain is starting to deteriorate because you've heard all this propaganda. You've heard wear a mask a zillion times. You hear all these things. Well, you've got to do this, and they're playing on your emotions. You don't want to kill grandma, do you? You got to do this. And so when it starts deteriorating, what do? They put in a new belief system. That's what's been installed. So they start to readjust your thinking. And that's exactly what's been happening. And then they get you to think, well, masks are vital. You'll die or kill someone else if you don't wear one. Now, I heard a story about a little boy, and he must have been like 4 or 6 years old. I think it was on Twitter, or I don't know where I saw it. But this little boy was so upset. I mean, he went into the store with his family, and when they came out, his mask came off. And all of a sudden, he just kind of collapsed and started screaming and crying. And his family was like, what's going on? What's wrong, son? And he finally said, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. My mask came off outside, and I'm just going to die. That's a horrible thing for a child to have to think. And it's not true, especially with children. It's definitely not true. And this is what they're trying to get in there. And, masks are vital. If you don't wear them, you're going to kill somebody. And now we've gotten to the point where that filter has been deteriorated to the point where we get a militant reaction when people don't wear a mask. That's why we go into stores and we see people that are ready to just take us down if we don't wear a mask. And that's why. They're at this point. Their filter has been just destroyed. The cognitive dissonance is not there anymore, and they believe everything. It's been replaced by the propaganda beliefs. And so, of course, you got to instill fear, which is part of this. And the fear is if you don't wear a mask, you'll die. That's what they're telling people. It's not true. The percentage of people that die is very, very small. Very small compared to all of us in the entire country and in the entire world if you take the global one. It's just not true, but that's what they're telling people. And then they also do the other part. If you don't wear a mask, you'll kill others and you'll be guilty of murder. Yeah, but funny how the people that are saying that are not the ones that are looking at Cuomo and his nursing home stuff. But if you don't wear a mask, the virus will come back worse and it'll be terrible. And you're going to kill millions of people. Again, that's the fear. The fear is if you don't do what we tell you to do, then you're going to die. Or someone's going to die and it's going to be your fault. That's the fear. And they've done a really good job of instilling it because this is what people believe. I've got some friends on Facebook that just, whenever I mention masks, they just jump all over me because they have fallen for the propaganda. So I wanted to share that with you, and I wanted to let you know what the types of things are to look for. And again, it works for the masks, it works for Black Lives Matter, it works for all of these different organizations and things. It works for what the Democrats do. They're very good at this type of manipulation. And this is what they're trying to implement. The problem is they can't implement it because far too many of us have good, strong filters in our brain. And we need to thank our parents for that mostly. But a lot of us also have learned over time that these are lies. These are just propaganda being told to us. And the filter in our brains is strong enough that it filters that out. Sometimes it has to be developed. In fact, if you're a Christian, it's called discernment, and it takes time to develop. Most people do not have discernment just right off the bat. You got to kind of let it grow. You've got to teach it how to discern good from evil. And when you're doing that, then it starts to become a little more clear as to when you're hearing the truth and when you're hearing propaganda. So, like for me, I've worked with so many people from so many different cults that when I'm presented with a religious doctrine that doesn't seem to line up with what I believe, it's pretty obvious to me that there's a problem with it because I know the Bible, I know the truth, and it makes it so much easier to discern what's wrong. And I want to close with this in case you've never heard this before. When they're trying to teach people how to spot a counterfeit bill, like bank people and everything, what they do is they don't try to show them every single counterfeit bill possibility out there because that's just an impossibility. They can't do it because there are so many options. It could be this changed or that changed. What they do is they study the real bill. And that's how they train themselves to spot the counterfeits, because they know what the real dollar bill looks like. And that way, when a fake one comes up, it's pretty obvious. So I encourage you to make sure you know the truth. And the truth is what's going to help you spot the false teachings out there. And they are teachings, Just because the media is putting it out doesn't mean it's not a teaching. They're trying to get their little doctrine in there, and you need to be able to spot it. How do you spot it? Training. You got to look at the truth. You've got to focus on the truth, and you've got to immerse yourself in it, because once you know the truth, then the fakes are going to be obvious. So that's what I've got for you on this one. I want to thank you for stopping by, and I'll see y'all later.